Thanks for welcome to this event with the Centre for New National Writing. Maybe you're not familiar with us before. My name's Dr. Daniel O'Connor. I'm one of the co-directors of the Centre for New International Writing with my colleagues, Professor Sandeep Parmar, Professor Darren Rees-Jones and Dr. David Herron, and we're delighted to have you. We run a series of events throughout the year, regular events with all kinds of speakers that we've had in the past: Terence Hayes, Forrest Gander, Meena Kandasamy, a whole range of speakers for various different events that we run within the department, but also within connection with Poetry Society as well. So do keep an eye out for those, particularly in the second semester. There's some brilliant things coming up. But tonight we are thinking about narratives in trauma. So it's beholden to me, first of all, to introduce our host for this evening, Natalie Wall, who is a PhD candidate, one of our wonderful PhD candidates that we have through the Centre for New National Writing, who is working on trauma fiction. She's looking at contemporary trauma fiction, thinking about theories of trauma fiction, approaching different ideas of ways of reading trauma fiction, particularly engaging with reader responses to trauma fiction. So I'll leave you in the capable hands of Natalie. Take it away, Natalie.
Thank you, Danny, for sort of introducing me there. I'm just going to hopefully pin Lucia and Nat to the centre for everyone. There we go. Hopefully that sort of worked for everyone there. Yeah, welcome and thank you everyone for coming tonight, and especially thank you to Lucia and Nat for agreeing to sort of take part in this discussion this evening. I'm just going to give sort of a brief introduction to Lucia and Nat before we sort of get started. So Lucia is a journalist and writer with her news reporting and literary work appearing in places like Granta, the Sunday Times, HuffPost UK, ABC News and The Guardian. She currently has 2 published books, I Choose Elena and My Body Keeps Your Secret, as well as a 3rd on the way about the Ghislaine Maxwell trial with 4th Estate Books, following her in-depth reporting on the subject. And Nat has a PhD from the Centre for New Writing at the University of Manchester, where he wrote the piece that would become In the Seen Hands of Others, his novel, which was released earlier this year. He's currently researching decay in 20th century queer literature and visual art. And he's also currently working as a bookseller in London. Just a bit of information about our brilliant speakers today. Just a quick note as well that both Nat and Lucia's work deal with aspects of trauma, memory, and the capturing of these things in narrative, particularly relating to sexual trauma. So this is just a preemptive trigger warning here that the discussion may make reference to sexual assault at some points. So I thought I'd just, before we get into sort of hearing some great readings from the speakers today, I thought I'd just give a little bit of information just about trauma in narrative. So yeah, trauma sort of disrupts narrative, both the narratives we might use to understand our own lived experiences of traumatic events, and in many representations of trauma in writing and literature as well, which both Lucia and Nat sort of explore in their writing in quite different ways. So it'll be interesting to hear from both of them today. So yeah, I'd like to invite Lucia and Nat to do a reading from some of their work now, just to give people a bit of an idea. So yeah, I don't know which one of you maybe wants to go first or anything like that.
I don't mind. What do you think, Nat?
After you, Lucia. Take it away.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. And thank you so much to everyone at the Centre for hosting this event. I'm I'm really glad that you guys programmed this, because I think the idea of how trauma and narrative relate to one another and also conflict with one another is really, really interesting. And I love Nat's novel, and so I'm very excited to be talking to you all about it. So I'm going to read a short section from the beginning of my second book, which is called My Body Keeps Your Secrets. And just as a very brief kind of set up for that, this book was born out of my first book, which was called I Choose Eleanor, and that was a memoir about my own sexual assault and recovery. But in the that book was very much confined to my story, which was statistically a very unusual one. So I was attacked by someone that I didn't know in the night. There were weapons involved. You know, statistically, we know that most people experience trauma at the hands of people that they know and love and trust. So I got a lot of emails when I published that first book saying, you know, what happened to me isn't as bad as what happened to you, but, you know, here's my story. And I was overcome with this sense of kind of wanting to correct that perception, you know, that there are versions of trauma that are much more extreme than others. And I wanted to write something that was more inclusive and a bit more universal, that didn't have to just stick to my own story. So I was thinking about the next book, and I said, you know, I want to talk about these people who are writing me these emails. And then that kind of became the book, is talking to those people who are writing me those emails. So this is based on interviews with about 100 people about trauma and recovery, and how they have kind of narrativized that in their own lives. In his book, Healing the Shame That Binds You, psychologist John Bradshaw talks about chronic shame or toxic shame. It's the kind of shame that comes from being told by society again and again that you are not good enough, that you are unworthy. It's the kind of shame transferred into our bones by a shameless act. It's the kind of shame passed down by traumatized mothers and fathers, the kind of shame handed to us by acts of violence and sexual entitlement. It's the kind of shame that gets under our skin through racist and sexist remarks in hallways, and in knowing the next character assassination is always just around the corner. That kind of shame, the kind backed up by generations of human history and by tall men in Oval offices and by school playgrounds and by magazines, can become a way of life. It can become its own identity. If we are taught by the most authoritative sources that our lives are less valuable, then shame becomes a constant companion, and hiding who we really are becomes a way of life. It certainly did for me. In this way, structural shame becomes personal. We act it out again and again in everything we do and think, because everything at its root can be explained by our conviction that we ought to keep hiding. So we starve ourselves, and we outbusy ourselves, and we Instagram filter ourselves, and we make ourselves sick, and we drink, and we escape, all to make sure no one actually sees us, all to protect ourselves from feeling exposed, from being found out. To protect ourselves from the moment we let people see that the self we project is a lie, a curated image cobbled together by society's ideas about what we should be. That underneath all of that is a real person, guilty of having so many of the things we are taught to be ashamed of, guilty of having real human skin and cheeks and wrinkles and bones, guilty of having needs, genuine, messy, human creature needs, guilty of having feelings that ricochet, guilty of being angry and sad and sometimes attached, guilty of needing help, guilty of having a body that takes up space in the world, guilty of having been hurt in ways we may never recover from, guilty of being raped, guilty of being hurt by the people who were supposed to protect us. Toxic shame is the voice that tells you you're worthless. I know now that one of the effects of untreated trauma on the body and mind is to make us ashamed, to make us believe that we are and always will be people to whom terrible things happen, people who deserve to be hunted. This is put best in Mira Atkinson's Traumata. Shame is often transmitted, paradoxically, by a shameless act, an act in which one person's avoidance of shame demands another carry it. I haven't stopped thinking about that sentence since I read it. Shame is transmitted, That's exactly the right verb. Shame is passed from one human heart to another. Atkinson says of the man who abused her, "I was ashamed for him, yet it was not my shame." Bradshaw says that when our lives get overtaken by chronic shame, we worthy. Every story in this book is about how we learned the value of the false self, how we unlearned it, how we told its story, and the price we paid trying to attain it. As the false self is formed, Bradshaw says, the authentic self goes into hiding. The false self is a masterpiece. Because the false self is an act of overcompensation for a part of us we believe to be damaged, he says, it is always either more than human or less than human. Brené Brown says that shame is an unbearable feeling, and so we do whatever we can not to bear it. We escape it, we numb it, however we can. We become addicted to overachieving, to alcohol, to drugs, to sex, to toxic friendship, to starving ourselves, to hurting ourselves. These are all ways to numb shame. They are also, it seems to me, ways for the false self to punish us for being defective and carrying shame. So the answer, I think, lies in finding a way to resist that escape. Brown says the best way to bear shame without numbing it is through empathy and connection. It's striking to me that she wrote this sentence long before the current iteration of the movement against sexual harassment and violence was born. Do you want to know the two most powerful words when we are in struggle? Me too. It strikes me that the false self is also the key to understanding why I and so many people in this book struggle to know what is real and what is not, which parts of the world might be true and which are to be doubted. Because we have always believed ourselves to be rotten and worthy of contempt. Our own perceptions of the world are not to be trusted. All our lives we have been taught to lie in order to stay alive, and eventually we do not trust ourselves when we tell the truth. My interview subjects told me details about their childhoods, their teenage years, their childbearing or otherwise years and beyond. I've attempted in this book to reconstruct their stories into a chronological narrative that takes you on a journey through one life made up of a constellation of different stories and experiences to show you the many ways shame and trauma can invade our lives and at how many different junctures it can appear. Imagine what we could do with the time and energy if we decided to tell the truth about our bodies, if we were to reject the idea that a woman's body is designed as a canvas to construct an alternate truth, and instead embrace the idea that it can be designed to be a truth in itself. In her book, Constellations, Sinead Gleason says, I am an accumulation of all those sleepless nights and hospital days, of waiting for appointments and wishing I didn't have to keep them, of the raw keel of boredom and self-consciousness that illness is. Without those experiences, I would not be a person who picks up those shards and attempts to reshape them on the page. If I had been spared the complicated bones, I would be someone else entirely, another self, a different map. Every woman and non-binary person carries complicated bones that they have been taught to believe are shameful, but they are not. The acts that make up these complicated bones, neglect, abuse, misogyny, objectification, are not our shame to carry. They are the beliefs and behavior of shameless people who refuse to carry it themselves. So over the centuries, things have become very confused. Our bones are not wretched in their complexity, but beautiful. They are testaments not to the worst things that have been done to us, but to how we survived them. This book is a testament to those complicated bones. I am glad I am not a different map.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Lucia. It was a really super interesting reading and a great sort of insight into what the rest of the book is about. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Nat, do you want to sort of read a section now as well?
Yeah, thank you for that, Lucia. I feel like that's encapsulated everything that I've been trying to do with my writing so far, and I feel like I don't really need to read, but I will for the formality of it all.
God needs to hear a wonderful novel.
Yeah, well, yeah, we'll see. I'm just going to read a few bits from the beginning. It's going to be a bit shorter and a bit more abstract, really. And something at the end that just to sort of it's pretty remarkable how the crossover between me and Lucia's book, just listening to that reading. I give a very short sort of précis of what the book is. It's a novel that's formed of documents and evidence that surround the rape trial, and it focuses largely on the aftermath of the rape trial through the blog posts of a nurse on a dialysis ward called Karina. And I'm going to read just a few, not very many, of those blog posts. It took 55 days for the word to begin to lose its dread. 66 days to manage the cinema in the afternoon alone. 94 days to imagine a day that I wouldn't feel dissolved. 98 to go to a pub. 135 to go to a busy bar. 159 to go to a busy bar, have a few drinks. 162 days to go to a busy bar, have a few drinks, let a friend, a girl, stay over with me in my bed. 188 days to walk the 10 minutes from Turnpike Lane station to my flat instead of waiting for the bus. 201 days to say once without doubt that it wasn't my fault. The 268th day was the first day I realized that a memory of what had happened hadn't made me sweat. The 371st day was the first day I remembered remembering your brother's face and not feeling scared, vulnerable, and then wanting to smash my fist into his nose, crack the ethmoid in half, flatten the septum, the cartilage mushed, skin burst until it couldn't be called a nose. No, I just felt a vague nausea, a kind of regret, almost like disappointment, which eventually turned into a black emptiness. The 548th day was the first day I slept without a knife hidden between the mattress and my headboard. On the 578th day, I put the knife back. On the 581st day, I heard that a girl I knew from uni had gone through something similar. I thought about messaging her to ask if she wanted to meet to talk, but I couldn't find the words. New patient on the ward. Anorexia has led to diabetes. I should say that this passage contains a few words that I haven't really managed to pronounce. So, new patient on the ward. Anorexia has led to diabetes, electrolyte imbalances, anemia, hypotension, causing repeated here's one, I'm going to move on. Chronic kidney disease. Vomiting. Too tired to hold the bowl herself. If tolerated, an antiemetic before a small meal of favorite food. Fish finger sandwich, tomato ketchup. 25 years old. She's been here a few times before. Last year, her mother agreed to donate a kidney. The girl was wheeled to surgery, but when they went to move the mother, her gown lay on the bed, hadn't been heard from since. The girl went on the transplant waiting list. She'll get a new kidney in 2 years, if she's lucky. EPO injection, phosphate binders, alpha-calcidol with meals, aggressive treatment of hyperlipidemia, possible dialysis. She fell asleep. I took a student nurse aside, the one who started crying when this girl went into hypoglycemic shock, who I told to get the fuck off the ward to pull himself together. I apologized for that. I told him tears are fine. It's good that he feels. You might wonder where these outbursts have come from. Last night, I dreamt of the room where your brother did what he did. I woke up, pinned by bedsheets, sweating, didn't trust my sleeping mind to let me out of that room. So I kept myself awake, out of the room of sleep. Is there any beating it? Not long after it happened, I moved into a flat across the city because I couldn't sleep in that room. Now I sleep to get rid of my body, my memory of it, but sleep uses my memory to take my body back to that room, that oven. Glomerular filtration rate under 40 milliliters per minute. Tipping point before progression to end-stage renal failure. IV iron. Aiming for ferritin under 150 nanograms per milliliter. Obtain daily weight. Clip nails. Avoid acute paronychia. Don't make it about quantitative development. The girl's stool was slightly more solid than the day before, floating in the water. Her hydration was better, blood pressure up. She wears a crucifix with a long gold chain that gets sharp bends in it from her clavicle. She reads a filthy Gideon's Bible, close up to her eyes, as she mouths the words, replacing pages that fall now and then. Her hair is thinning, falling out. Elsewhere on our body, she's furry. Except for extremely underweight people, only newborn babies have this kind of down. It's insulation the body grows to protect itself. In the morning, the girl wept openly over an untouched sandwich, kind of forcing it out, like clearing your throat, exhausted, saying, "I just want to disappear." You might think repair means two things reuniting, becoming a pair again. Actually, it comes from the Latin for repatriate, as in to return to one's country. I read this as my mother drifted around the border of sleep. Do you know how we can repair when we're separated from the closest thing we have to our own countries, our bodies? I mean, did we ever have a country to call our own? Were what we thought were borders only features of always being already separated from ourselves, crossed by others? Thank you.
Thank you for that really brilliant reading as well. And yeah, like you were saying, they're very different, but they do have a lot of sort of similarities between the two books there. So it's going to be a really interesting discussion of both. Yeah, thank you so much for your readings. Just want to say to you, the people attending as well, we're going to sort of go into more of sort of a discussion now, but if you guys have any questions, then feel free to put them in the chat. And towards the end, when we have time to look at questions, we can sort of go through and pick them out there, just so people don't sort of think they have a question and sort of forget about it, which is what I would always do in sort of sessions like this. So yeah, feel free to drop them in. But yeah, I think when I was sort of thinking about sort of the two texts from you guys, I think what really sort of stood out to me was they're both sort of obviously made up of these sort of fragments of like different different sources, different people, whether they're sort of real sources or sort of fictional ones. And I was just sort of wondering, what was sort of the process of putting these narratives together from these different sort of constituent parts, I guess? How did that look for both of you?
You go first this time, Nat, and also because I really want your answer to this.
It was a mess, and I think appropriately so. I think one of the fundamental things about trauma is that it sort of resists or even contradicts narrativization. It's sort of, I think Lucia's book goes into this wonderfully about the unspeakable leading to shame, and that's sort of by definition what trauma seems to hinge on. So it is sort of, it sort of resists a linear narrative. It resists a linear telling. I mean, it even resists the very fact of giving account of the experience. So for me, it was messy, but it sort of had to be. And I guess for me as well, I was interested more in exploring the after effects of a traumatizing experience in various different contexts. In the personal, professional, juridical, and I guess the sort of police procedural. So that led me down the path of amassing a various amount of documents and just trying to see if an experience can be related, or maybe not that, because for me, it's interesting that it's hard to talk about the narrative because it came out so piecemeal, and it came out so I worked on it. It was a fragmentary way of working on it because it was part of a PhD, and I was kind of doing critical work as well. So I kind of dipped in and out of it sporadically in relation to what I was reading about and thinking about. So it didn't have a sort of linear writing process either. So yeah, sorry, I feel like I've digressed too much from the question there, but it was a mess.
No, it's fine.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, that was such a fascinating answer, Nat. This idea of this is something I'm really interested in as well, this idea that trauma kind of by its very nature resists both language and linear narrative. So it's very, very hard to kind of tame it into a linear narrative. And sometimes it's just best not to. I think embracing the messiness is one of the ways that we can kind of accurately depict trauma and how it affects us. And I think, that came through a lot, both in my interviews and with struggling to write the book, which was also a total mess for the same reason. So, I interviewed people over 2 years, and often, they would tell me a story at the beginning of our relationship, at the beginning of these interviews. But the story they really wanted to tell me wouldn't be brought up until 12 months later, and often, the idea of being able to speak about trauma is so contingent on kind of trust and care and love and empathy. And so often, the story that you tell people first is not the real story, is not what you really want to say. So this book changed so much as I was interviewing people. It became about completely different things. And then in the writing of it, that tension is there as well. This book is quite fragmentary. There are lots of gaps in it. And I write about that in the beginning of the book because I did have this conversation with editors about the fact that there are gaps that the reader will want to, if this were a novel, that these gaps would have to be filled in terms of backstory and different parts of these people's lives. And that we talked about whether I should push my interview subjects for these details that a reader might want. And I think a really, really, really important thing about respecting trauma narratives is to not do that. So I really wanted to resist doing that in the writing of it and kind of allow the narratives to be exactly as they were told to me, rather than to try and tidy them up, which is our kind of instinct as writers, and which is why trauma and writing have such a strange relationship, because we want things to be tidy, but trauma doesn't really work like that. And I think it's really important to respect that. So that's something I had in my head while I was writing this, which is why I think, it is a very messy book in the end, because I decided to kind of prioritize keeping the truth of that messiness rather than trying to hide it.
Yeah, I mean, it just that made me think about how so much of both of our books, but in different ways, hinge on the sort of dialogue, like dialogue between people, dialogue between communicative contexts, between discursive contexts, all of that sort of stuff. And I think I'm kind of interested in the formal juxtapositions of how experiences are related, and seeing how those sort of frictions between those communicative contexts can shed light on an experience that is unspeakable, not obliquely, I suppose the word is. And I think because it's that fundamental question of like how can someone narrativize an experience when the position that they're narrating from, when the idea of before an experience and after experience is incommensurable. You can't reconcile before and after. So that's so unamenable to narrative. So then for me, and this is what I got through reading Lucia's book, and something I was thinking about when I was writing the book, but maybe not conscious of it until I read Lucia's book, was that the idea of narrative seems to be less about relating an experience than like the experience of relating, of relation, of people interacting, of forms interacting, of languages colliding, and it sort of has to be, because it's you can't just say it straight, you know, can't just by definition.
That's such a good point about the experience of relating, and I think that's what I love so much about your novel, is that it captures the aftermath of an event like this in a way that is so true to the reality of it, because we're presented with all these documents which reflect the way the story is told to different people and in different settings, and we kind of have to piece together what happened through those different kind of experiences of relating, and that is so much, that is so true to what processing trauma is actually like. And I think that the form of your novel kind of, it's such a brilliant way of capturing that, I think.
Tries to be.
Yeah, thank you for those insights. Yeah, I think what was really interesting is this idea you both said of it being sort of messy and trying to create something out of something which is like inherently sort of messy and that sort of defies logic in some ways, defies sort of a linear structure. I'm sort of interested then if, I guess, sort of how you guys almost like came upon the kind of central idea that you wanted to try and convey within that sort of messiness, and how you maybe went about trying to get that central idea, whether it was sort of this idea of shame or whatever it might be, how you got that to sort of come out within this sort of messiness around it or in the process.
You go ahead, Nat.
I'm not sure that I have a very good answer, because I'm sort of struggling to even wrangle the messiness in this answer. It doesn't, the whole thing just sort of resists any synthesis or clarification, which is not a very good answer. It's a non-answer, in fact. And I suppose, I guess, so the use of the documents, I suppose, I can, as a way to answer that, is instead of trying to sort of solve any messiness or find some kind of resolution or find some synthesis or any kind of, I don't know, anything beyond just letting the mess be, I was sort of interested in how the form or certain forms might work against the human messiness. And I think there's something about documents and the sort of bureaucratic sort of discourses that try to clarify or coordinate or regulate and try to clarify, but in doing so maybe distort the messiness of life. And I suppose for me, I was interested in shining a light on those processes, on the ways in which certain institutional logics try to wrangle or make sense of messiness. Again, I don't know if that's a very good answer, but that's where my my focus was aimed, I suppose.
No, that's definitely a really interesting answer. Yeah, because I think there's potentially not always a first a central sort of thing that is oh, I definitely need to get that across, when the whole thing is kind of speaking to the whole experience. It's hard to sort of pick one thing out sometimes. Sorry, Lucia, do you want to sort of answer it as well?
Yeah, so this was a really interesting process for me, because I had ideas about how to do this at the beginning of the book that were then completely overtaken by the actual experience of interviewing people and talking to them about things that have happened to them and how they've recovered. And, it goes back to what Nat said about the kind of experience of relating. This I had a whole plan about how I was going to reconcile trauma with narrative in this book, and how I was going to try and make those two things work, even though they're so hard to, you know, it resists synthesis. But then as I was speaking to people, and my life became kind of overtaken by that experience of sitting with people and talking for hours and hours and hours about these experiences, I just learned that it seemed to me that it would be so much better to allow the messiness of that to kind of stand on its own, rather than, as the writer, try and take control of it, because the experiences that I had of being told these stories was so kind of reflective of how trauma is processed and how we speak about it, which is very iterative. You know, it's completely non-linear. You'll get different parts of a story at different times, and you have to kind of piece together a narrative. And, you know, I learned from the people I was speaking to that I shouldn't try and wrangle too much control over the way that they told their stories, because, you know, that experience of me sitting with them and listening is what I really wanted to capture in the book, you know, because I have come to believe that experience is a key part of recovery, and there's something in that can help us understand trauma better. The fact that when we relate it in this way, it helps us make sense of it, and it helps us recover. You know, I really wanted that to be the central focus of the book, and so I wanted the kind of reality of those interviews to kind of be allowed to stand, rather than, you know, my original plan, which was to kind of assert much more control over them.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was something that I really sort of took from reading My Body Keeps Your Secrets, is that, yeah, all of these accounts sort of stand by themselves, and you have sort of your like interjections sort of spaced throughout them that only kind of adds to, I don't know, the overall sort of themes of the book and stuff. It doesn't add to their stories, it just adds sort of around, yeah, sort of around the borders of them, and sort of, I guess, contextualizes them in a wider sort of a wider sort of exploration of trauma and recovery, but it doesn't sort of seek to really like explain someone else's experience like at all, which is obviously how it should be when you're speaking about trauma like that. Yeah, I think, you know, because both of your books really look at sort of the aftermath of a traumatic experience, sort of in very different ways and in different forms as well. And, you know, we've talked about this idea of, you know, trauma really disrupting a narrative. And I wondered if this disruptive power of it, I know we've already talked about it a little bit, but how you sort of saw this disruptive power, I guess, taken form in your like works, whether it was in like the form that they were taking, or anything like that, sort of how that disruption was born out, really.
Do you want to go first, Nat?
Maybe you should go first. I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is such an interesting question, this idea, you know, when I first started researching and reporting on trauma, this idea of its kind of disruptive power was one of the first things that kind of really helped me absorb what I was learning about trauma, both in my own life and, you know, in the people that I was speaking to. And I think that's key. It's really key to understanding it and to trying to communicate that to people who haven't been through traumatic experiences. The way that it kind of pulls you out of your own story, and really kind of pulls apart the linear elements of your life, and that idea of it being disruptive to your sense of self and the story that you tell about yourself is really, really key. And I was doing an interview for my third book the other day, which is on a similar topic, and the interview subject said, I just remember walking out of the room when she'd had a traumatic experience, walking out of the room and thinking, I will never trust myself again. And that was this kind, and that the room that she was walking out of, she was looking around and thinking, everything is different. Everything is different to when I walked in here 30 minutes ago. Everything has changed. And that sense of disruption, I think, is really important, because it is what separates traumatic memories from other kinds of stressful or distressing memories. And so that's a really key part of how the brain, responds to and creates symptoms of trauma. So I was really interested in capturing that, whatever that moment was for people, or however that disruption kind of showed up in their lives. And there will always be a version of the kind of before and after. And Roxane Gay writes about this really beautifully in her memoir about assault, is that, there's a version of her life before this happened and a version afterwards. And that was true for everyone I interviewed. And I really wanted to try and make that the crux of their chapter, is kind of, what that disruption looked like for them, and then how they eventually kind of started to recover and started to repair that disruption. So yeah, I wanted to kind of put that front and center.
I suppose for me, the idea of disruption, it manifests on the level of form, I suppose, with the fragmentary form, the fragment for the various juxtapositional documents. And I suppose for me, it was sort of riding that wave of constant disruption in order to enact a sort of experience of trauma on the page or in the reading experience, as far as that can in some way carry an imprint of trauma, without, because I think with language, it's sort of geared toward piecing things together. It's geared towards sense making, and I think the challenge is to stay true to the disruptive element, to the kind of unspeakableness, to the sort of inarticulable aspects of trauma, while also I guess I'm interested in that sort of the paradoxical shift between disruption, fragmentation, and a sort of piecing together, but without any sense of cohesion. I mean, it's sort of a kind of, I suppose it's just entering into a phase of constant aftermath. There's no plateau. I mean, maybe there are moments of plateau, but it's this sort of constant wrestle with disruption. There's never, and I think it would be false to try and to think otherwise. To try and have some sort of conclusion. Like how I think so many sort of, I don't know. There's a novelist. I think in the novelistic context as well, to sort of have a denouement and a conclusion, just sort of, it just doesn't really make sense in this context, so for me it was trying, and there's so many great writers that and books that have paved the way for that. I think Lucia talks about it in her book, The Argonauts, this sort of spiraling, fragmentary, genre bending thing that sort of circles around a question. And again, I think Lucia uses like the questioning form perfectly. I think that kind of irresolvable sort of approach, just the questions. And I think it's really interesting how Lucia's interactions with the people that she talks with, there's no sense in which Lucia says, well, yes, this is what this means for me. And I think those interactions are disrupted by Lucia's own self-interrogations without any answers. And I think that is a really good enacting of what we're talking about here, this kind of looping back without any. The loop is the disruptive loop, I suppose. That's what I'm talking about, and I've tried to sort of capture that formally.
And I think you did such a good job of using form in this novel to do that. Just the way that we get a sense of the fact that this, as you said so eloquently, that this kind of constant aftermath is a loop of, just kind of having to ask yourself the same questions again and again and again, which we kind of sense that Corinna is doing, and the fragments and the different kind of perspectives and on that night that we get are kind of such a powerful formal way, I thought, to capture that what is essentially a loop. And as Maggie Nelson puts it, you just have to keep writing the same story again and again and again in order to make any sense of it. And that's what kind of separates traumatic experiences from more regular ones. And I loved the way that you were able to render that formally in the novel.
I think it goes back to the dialogue as well, doesn't it? I mean, the kind of the dialogic loop of the sort of not the kind of monologic straight ahead, the kind of the back and forth, endless sort of emergence through relation, I think. And I think kind of where what both of our books seem to have in common is this conception of selfhood as relational, as knitted together, as a self-other kind of formulation, not as me telling this is my experience, this is what's happened. And I think there's so many great writers that have explored that. I mean, I the first one comes to mind, probably Judith Butler. I suppose she's kind of the main person who's talked about the relational self in my sort of reading anyway. Yeah.
I promise this is the last thing I'll say about this, but that is such a good point, because the often the thing about trauma is that it is a relational wound. It is kind of a really primary relational wound. And the thing that I've learned both in practice and in my own treatment and in research and reporting and all of that is that relational wounds are healed relationally. That experience of relating to another person in a way that is safe is a huge part of recovery. And so that idea of recovering the relational self from trauma, I think, is key and comes across really, really powerfully in your novel.
Thank you.
I think something really interesting that you both sort of touch on there is, I know, this quality that trauma has of it's like demanding sort of impossible things from writers, isn't it? It's like you're saying these things that are very difficult to sort of even imagine, like ideas of constant disruption. It's something which seems like a bit of an oxymoron, I guess, for it to be constant. So the difficulty of rendering trauma and its effects in narrative, was there anything that you wanted to try and show about the aftermath of trauma, but you just it was just too resistant to being represented in words, in narrative, even anything that just really sort of eluded you, I guess, in your process of your writing?
Do you want to go first now?
I can do, yeah. I think it's that's a really good question. it's my answer might not be that satisfactory. Is that it all eluded me as far as I can tell, and I think because it is by definition elusive, and I suppose the one thing that I suppose I did want to capture in spite of that elusiveness is the sense of its elusiveness. I know that's a sort of wanky thing to say maybe, but to try and capture the slipperiness and the soft shaky ground of it all, to capture that sense that's my spontaneous reaction. I'm not sure. I can't help but think it all eluded me.
I think that, I mean, this is such a good question, and I also think it kind of all eluded me. But I remember thinking very clearly about this in kind of some of the copy editing stage of both of the books, because there were inconsistencies in some of my memories in these books, and you know, the what we want from narrative is consistency, but the nature of traumatic memory means that it's very, very hard to kind of have a detailed rendering of a particular memory. And I remember being, you know, my first instinct was to try and kind of massage the memories into shape so that they kind of fit a linear narrative, and so that all the details were there. But of course, I ended up realizing that you know, that wouldn't be nonfiction writing. You know, like in order to write about this truthfully, I had to kind of truthfully render the fact that there are gaps in certain memories. There are, you know, things that I will probably never be able to remember, things that are remembered out of sequence, you know, all of that kind of thing. And ultimately, I found that there was no way of kind of reconciling that with what we think of as being kind of good narrative practice. And so I had to just give up on doing that and let the memories be fragmented and disrupted and sometimes improperly, you know, remembered, just as they were, you know, because if we are to make any progress in kind of understanding why trauma affects us the way it does, we have to understand that, you know, the fact that these memories are very, very hard to put into a linear narrative, you know, and the brain stores them in a way that is fragmented, rather than narrated in the way that we as writers are taught to narrate our own lives or other people's lives. So that was something that always eluded me, and then I realized that it eluding me is kind of the point, and to just kind of let those gaps stand on their own.
Yeah, I really like the phrase you had there, trying to massage a memory into sort of the shape that you want it, that you might want it to fit. I feel like that's a really, really interesting image for, yeah, how sometimes, you know, we feel like we remember something in one way and then another way, a different time, and we try and mold them to fit some middle ground, perhaps. Yeah, I've obviously talked a lot about the way that, you know, trauma can kind of elude, you know, certain aspects of representing trauma can like elude you or sort of resist being narrated. I'm sort of wondering how that potentially kind of fits in with almost like navigating ideas of like truth in the narratives, you know, whether it's a fictional narrative or whether it's actually narrating someone's real life experience. You know, how important, or was it sort of a key concern to try and have sort of an objective truth as much as you can have one in like a fictional narrative? Or were you more concerned with what felt like, you know, the felt truth and experiences of characters and like interviewees that you spoke to? Yeah, bit of a big question there, I know, but any thoughts, even if they're just sort of tiny?
Well, I mean, I think it's such an interesting question, and it's something I thought about a lot while writing this second book. And you do, especially, I'm a journalist by trade, and so you're taught this idea of kind of objective facts and things that can either be corroborated or not. But I decided, after thinking about this for a long time, that what was important to me in this book was the truth of the way these individuals experienced their own lives. And I wanted to make sure that that was kind of really, really the focus of the book, because, it was something that I felt that I could contribute to a conversation about trauma, because I feel like sometimes the truth of those individual experiences is not prioritized, and structurally, institutionally, we are kind of obsessed with not prioritizing the lived experience of people who've survived this kind of thing. And I really wanted this book to be a bit of a protest against that. And I wanted to try and first and foremost render what I experienced listening to these people and seeing the truth in their eyes and in their, really feeling what they were telling me. And as I said earlier, that the only way you do that is by talking to someone, for a year or 2 years, rather than just trying to kind of cut corners and direct someone to say, what happened next, and what's the next part of your story, because I don't think that you can get to the truth of someone's experience that way. And I just, you do have to make choices about your methodology and about what you think is important. And in this book, ultimately, I decided that this idea of objective truth, there are plenty of books that kind of focus on that, but I really wanted to privilege the kind of lived experience of people that have been silenced, and that whose lived experience is often undermined or discredited, and I wanted to give those experiences a space for that truth to kind of be able to exist and not have the tensions that it often does in our kind of broken systems and institutions.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I mean, it's something that I just never really, the idea talking about fiction and objective truth, I've just never really ever been able to get my head around it. I don't really know what fiction is or what it's doing in relation to that question. I have to be honest. I suppose for me, I kind of whenever I like approach a novel or a sort of fictional thing, I do kind of quite like to approach it as an exhibit, as sort of pretentious as that might sound, in the sense of collecting various artifacts or a semblance of an artifact of an experience or that kind of thing, and making a kind of exhibition. And I think, like, the way I like to think of it, like the reason why I like to think about that is sort of etymologically, an exhibit is the idea of holding out. It means to hold out. And I think by collecting fragments of an objective reality, I keep getting tied up when I talk about fiction and objectivity, but the idea of a fiction that holds out fragments of an objective reality. And I think that's a bad answer, but I suppose when I'm thinking about trauma as well, is that in relation, obviously when I'm writing, I'm writing in relation to an objective reality, and obviously an immense amount of research goes into writing about these subjects, or it has to. And I suppose in some ways I like to think of trauma as when an objective reality is felt, or like a systemic structural reality is felt. This is a bad answer. I'm derailing myself, but I don't know is the answer. I don't know how. Yeah, I'm sorry, bad answer. I don't know. I can never really reconcile objectivity and fiction, only insofar as to stay true to an objective reality. That's the best I can do. Maybe I don't know. Sorry.
No, I don't think that's a bad answer at all, because I think, you know, this topic and trauma in fiction, it does complicate all of these questions of things like reality and truth and like objectivity. So yeah, I feel like it's necessarily going to be something which is sort of complicating that idea sort of all the way through. Just got one last question from me, and then we can sort of look at some of the questions in the chat. And I apologise if this may be a bit of a brutal last question to leave on, but I was just thinking all the way through, you know, we're talking about some of the problems of like rendering trauma in writing, in narrative. But I was sort of wondering if, I don't know, again, let's say it might be a bit of a brutal last question, but if there's anything that you think that writing or novels or narrative has that makes it, you know, an interesting or a good medium for representing trauma that maybe other mediums, like say, you know, just speaking about it or film or something, maybe doesn't have.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. And I think the thing, I mean, Nat was talking earlier about these things being unspeakable, and that being a kind of key part of the aftermath of traumatic experiences. And I think that while, as we've said, writing is kind of inherently antithetical to rendering trauma, because writing focuses on narrative and sense making and all of those things. So in a way, the tension is completely unavoidable, and therefore in that way it is not at all the best way to dive into this topic. But I do think that there is something else going on. Firstly, that if a writer does it thoughtfully, you can express that tension in a way that helps other people understand what those kind of what it's like to live in those two different worlds, you know, one where things are linear and make sense, and one where things are completely disrupted and iterative and in a loop. And I think that writing can convey, you know, that really difficult tension. And also, I think that it is a very powerful, you know, the good thing about writing is that it's allowed to take its time, and it's a safe space for people to kind of process experiences in a way that they can't do often can't do in spoken relating, for example, or in spontaneous relating, because it is just too difficult. And writing for me has always been where I process things that I couldn't process in any other form. And I think reading other people's writing on trauma does that for us as well. So I think it has a superpower that kind of offsets the fact that it's otherwise otherwise writing and trauma are very strange bedfellows, but you know, it works.
Yeah, I would agree completely. I think the reason why it works is precisely because there's a vexed intimacy between the unspeakable and speaking, and I think writing is able to again, this is sort of, God, sorry, I just got blasted in the face by a lie. Writing is able to, again, this is just got a kind of bad way of putting it, or kind of perfect way of putting it. It's able to capture the uncapturable in some sense, or capture the essence of an uncapturable experience. It's able to capture, in terms of trauma, the kind of the simultaneous internal shattering and external silencing in a really interesting way, because it's so intimately and vexed. It has this, like I said, this vexed intimacy within those two things. And I think writing seems to be geared toward the idea of sense making and judgment. And I think this is something that has just sort of occurred to me through reading Lucia's book, and more engaging with, on thinking more about the idea of shame. And it seems to me that sort of the idea of judgment sort of sits in a kind of nexus of shame, narrative, and trauma, you know, in the sense that, you know, judgment as a kind of epistemology of self-possession. You know, you possess a rational judgment. I'm able to give account of myself. I'm able to make sense of my experience. I'm able to narrate. I'm able to speak. I'm able to talk about what's happening with me. Judgment as the imposition of and the internalization of normative social norms, you know, the fear of being judged, shame. And then obviously judgment as the kind of machinery of the judicial process, you know. Right. And I think all of those interlink in a way that writing and the kind of a discursive engagement can reveal. And especially in relation to trauma, writing about trauma throws all of that into question. Trauma is a self-dispossession. So to write about a self-dispossession in relation to what a judicial process requires, which is self-possession and being able to give account of yourself. And I think writing can really intercept that formula and throw it all into question. I think it's geared toward being able to do that, I think.
Thank you so much for those answers. And yeah, we're going to take a little look at the questions in the chat. So let me just scroll up. We've had a few in as sort of the discussion's been going. So if I just take this first one here, we have someone asking, what do you think creative non-fiction can do for people that fiction can't, and vice versa? Yes, going a little bit off the question about writing there. Yeah, any sort of thoughts about that?
I think about this question all the time. And I think the two different forms can each offer really key things that the other can't, especially when it comes to trauma and things that are inherently difficult to speak about. So creative nonfiction, you know, when you are writing something that is true, and when you're saying to the world, you know, I am accountable to the truth of this, you know, I have to be able to prove this, you know, I'm standing behind the truth of this, that can give something weight in some senses. And I think that's why I was kind of originally really interested in creative nonfiction. But fiction has a lot more freedom to, I think, render the more difficult truths, you know, the real grey areas here that sometimes, you know, sometimes if we are speaking about ourselves, or if we're speaking about stories that we've been told, and we have to stand by the truth of it. Sometimes it's really hard to look squarely at some of the really murky areas. And, you know, I think that fiction has an amazing ability to do that, because it has more freedom to be a little bit, you know, to take a little bit of distance from an idea of objective truth. I think it is much better at helping us understand the parts that we still can't say, or that we still can't make sense of when we're called on to speak about our own lives, or to speak about something that has to be truthful.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have much to add to that. Yeah, I agree. I think, yeah, I would agree. I think fiction, the only thing that fiction has, it can hang in nonsense. It can hang in the lyrical for a while. It can engage with abstraction. Maybe it's got more license to engage with abstraction, and especially in terms of thinking about trauma, I think it has maybe a bit more license to probe around in the mess of felt experience, perhaps more than non-fiction can. But at the same time, fiction has more of a demand to it has to, you know, be gripping. And I mean, non-fiction does as well, but there's a kind of has to tell you know, a gripping story about, well, they should. I don't know if mine does, but it should, ideally, apparently. And I suppose there are certain I guess it's more about the publishing industry, is what I'm getting towards, is that there are certain demands and expectations of what a novel has to do as a form, as a generic form, that sometimes can feel like a sort of inauthentic drama. You know, when maybe you just want to really squarely explore the ideas of something. It's like, you know, through my editing experiences, through going through an edit, it's like, yeah, but where's the story needs to keep moving, you know? And I think that's sort of antithetical to writing about trauma. Those kind of generic conventions and expectations.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting idea about, yeah, potentially like expectations from outside, you know, then making sort of the possibilities of sort of fiction sort of smaller than they sort of potentially could be for exploring trauma. So we have another question as well, which says, it feels to me like a lot of contemporary literary fiction and life writing has trauma as an operative theme. Do you think that's true? And if it is, why is that the case? It's a very big question there. One of the main questions of my sort of PhD thesis. If any of you have an answer, that would be great, actually. No pressure though. But yeah, so yeah, do you see that, and any ideas or any just personal thoughts of why, maybe?
I think, you know, it's definitely true that we're living in a moment where a lot of literature has trauma as one of its kind of central questions. And, you know, it's really interesting to think about why that is. I think one of the reasons is that we are coming off the back of kind of 2 or 3 decades in which we actually have been kind of looking at the neuropsychology of trauma in a different way. And there's all this new research about trauma and how it affects our lives that is kind of, you know, we're living in a moment where we're learning much more about this than at any other point in human history, and kind of correcting past misconceptions that we've had about trauma and memory and disruption, and how it impacts the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. So I think that has to be part of it. The fact that kind of writers are inherently interested in new ideas and, you know, challenging the way we used to think about things, and that's something that has been happening in trauma research recently, and so it's kind of ripe field for writers to dive into. And then there's obviously a political element of it as well. You know, that we're living in a time when it's become a political battleground, and so that is going to be reflected in art and vice versa.
Yeah, I can only reiterate what Lucia said. I'm trying to think about where this turn might have taken place, if there was a turn at all. I mean, I wonder if writing has always been about trauma, and to some extent, I mean, it seems to me, at least, that in sort of so much of like Western sort of narrative hinges on trauma of some form, whether we have the kind of self-reflect, whether, as Lucia says, we now have the language to reflect on what is actually happening, but so much of narrative hinges on trauma in some sense, and maybe more so as a betrayal, you know. I mean, like, it seems to me that all sort of Western narratives seem to hinge on some kind of betrayal, which is a kind of violation of kinship, which, you know, is adjacent to what a trauma might be. I think I'd probably just, I'd agree with Lucia, is that I think maybe we just have the language now, or the language has become, the tools in which to talk about trauma have been developed to this point where, I suppose I would agree.
Yeah, it's really interesting to think about sort of the question of when this might have sort of happened and why, definitely. So we have another question as well, asking, are there any writers who have particularly influenced your writing about trauma? We mentioned sort of a few throughout this discussion, but yeah, anyone in particular?
You go first this time, Nat, because I really want to hear your answer to this.
Judith Butler, probably, I think, is the main one. Her writing on, I mean, it's not explicitly about the sort of neuroscience or like the hard science of trauma, but her writing on precarious life, and it has been really, that was the kind of step in for me. And again, that's sort of within the context of, you know, relational concepts of the self and stuff. And I think in terms of more directly about trauma, Linda Martine Alcoff was a big one for me. There's an amazing book called Rape and Resistance, which it's quite like hard theory at times, but it's remarkable. And Cassie Primo Steele is a literary theorist who's written about trauma and poetry. Her book We Heal from Memory was a real benchmark for me, just theoretically, and many, but they're the first three that come to mind.
I mean, the writers that have really kind of shaped my writing over the last few years, at least initially, very much people like Gabor Mate and Bessel van der Kolk, and Peter Levine, people who are either clinicians or researchers, and who have found a way through their careers kind of wrestling with trauma and or treating traumatized people, have found a way to express that through narrative nonfiction, and convey these new ideas about trauma, and convey to us how and why they know them to be true. You know, that kind of movement in the writing world has completely changed my approach, both as a reader and as a writer. You know, The Body Keeps the Score. You know, I often think about my life before I read that book, and then my life after I read that book. So those are the main ones. And then more recently, I'm actually more and more interested in the way that fiction is able to, as I said before, kind of delve into these topics with a complexity that perhaps nonfiction can't. And certainly that version of nonfiction where you're retelling things that have been told to you, you know, fiction. I'm really interested in the way that novels can explore the murkier parts of this. So A Little Life, for example, is another. I don't know if that's like an uncool thing to say, but whatever, I don't care. That novel also completely changed the way I understood trauma, including my own. And that's an example of a novelist who, you know, has said that she got to that understanding of what she depicts in that novel through speaking to people. You know, she's never said, I had this experience myself. It is all just her power of empathy and connection and being able to try and understand these experiences. And then she renders it in a way that is so real. You know, and that book, I think, really conveys, you know, just how much novels can do in terms of helping us to understand an otherwise very slippery truth and a very slippery concept.
Sorry, I was still muted there. Yeah, it's really great hearing sort of a big sort of spectrum of different texts there, from fictional, sort of really theoretical sort of ways of understanding trauma and sort of influencing your own writing on it. Because it's something that's so slippery, like you say, sometimes you need sort of multiple different ways people have thought about it to even get a handle on it sort of yourself and how you might want to think about it or write about it. I've actually got one sort of final question, which might make for really good time, actually. So we have, in light of what you've both said about the difficulties of narrativizing trauma and its inherent messiness, I was wondering how you found the experience of working with editors, agents, publishing houses, etc., to publish the books. Really interesting question there.
Such a good question. I think this is Lizzie's question. Thanks, Lizzie. I mean, this fascinated me and continues to, because, you know, because we are living through this moment where we are, as a society, quite interested in trauma and quite interested in depictions of trauma. And one of the problems with writing trauma is that, you know, you have this very long and involved wrestle with yourself about how to do it, and then of course, you know, that process then involves other people. It involves editors and, you know, people whose job is to come in after you've done that process and point out where you've gone wrong and where things don't make sense to readers. And, you know, and that's, you know, I had, as I said before, I had lots of experiences of kind of editors being like, you know, this memory doesn't quite match up to this, or that, you know, and then having to deal with that tension and being okay with leaving it there. And as I said earlier with this second book, a lot of the editors who worked on that book really wanted me to push interview subjects for more information that would kind of round out stories and kind of make them a bit more satisfying, which I completely understand. It's that tension between methodology and craft, you know. So they were kind of rightly saying this will be a better narrative if it's more filled in. And ultimately, I had to really ask myself, what to do with that. And the decision I came to was that it's better to prioritize the methodology, the kind of journalist and writer that I want to be, and not push people for information they don't want to give for the sake of a tidier narrative. But it's so, I feel so lucky that I was able to go through that process with editors, because they're able to point out where from a reader's perspective there are gaps, and then that's the only way I could think clearly about those gaps and think about what to do with them.
Yeah, it was a particular challenge. Mine was a lot messier before, and it was a sort of slightly, I suppose it was a slightly uncomfortable process, from something that was quite like defiantly all over the place and sort of nonsensical in many senses, but half intentionally. And then I suppose it's interesting in the context of it being a debut novel as well, because I remember having conversations about, what making a sort of splash in the market is, is a kind of, it's a priority from a publishing perspective. And I think that there's a lot of friction between that and there's probably quite a lot of friction between that and any debut writer. But then when you're writing about trauma and it's, as Lizzie says, it's inherent messiness, that becomes even more fraught, or it can do. It's a better novel, I think, for it, but whether that's a better depiction of or mode of enacting trauma, I'm not really sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess that kind of comes back to what you were saying before about whether people's expectations of a novel and what a novel should be might hinder enacting the experience of trauma sort of in a narrative. I think we're sort of coming up to sort of the end now, so that's really fit in quite nicely with all of the questions there. I just wanted to say, thank you so much to Nat and Lucia for this fantastic discussion of trauma and narrative. It's definitely given me some new things to think about representation of trauma, and some new things to put onto my reading list to look at as well. And I'm sure, it's been given sort of similar things to everyone listening as well. Just want to say thank you as well to everyone for their great questions, which added a lot to the discussion tonight. And if you would like to sort of keep up to date on events at the centre, or Lucia and Nat's work, then go and follow them on social media, or on Twitter or something like that, for insights and updates, what people are up to. And just a really big thank you for coming and speaking with us this evening.
And thank you for having us. Thank you to the centre and all of you for organising. I've been wanting to have this conversation for ages, and I'm so glad I got to have it here with Nat. So thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, Lucia. Thank you, Natalie.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for coming.
I just wanted to say as well, I think it's in the chat, but a recording will be sort of available shortly on the centre website as well. So just wanted to drop that in at the end. But thank you so much. I hope everyone has a really good rest of their evening.
Yeah, thanks for coming, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
My mouse is kind of frozen. I'm just sort of stuck.
Champion, that was brilliant. Thanks very much.
Oh, was it okay? I was worried I was talking too much myself.
No, not at all. Not at all. It was really nice. It was really nice that they just spoke to each other as well.
Yeah, I know. When that started happening, I was like, thank you.
It was like a brilliant conversation for your thesis, that wasn't it?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I'll definitely look at the recording afterwards to see.
Right.
Yeah,
Smashing. It's so funny that someone effectively asked a question.
I saw that question. I was kind of like, oh, okay.
Yeah, let's see if we can get 2 years off this thesis. But that's champion. Yeah. So thanks very much. That was brilliant.
Thank you for suggesting it.
Yeah, it was good, wasn't it?
Yeah.
It's good. Smashing. So yeah, well, I'll see you in December, won't I?
Yeah, I'll see you. Yeah, around. Yeah. Yeah. Have a good evening.
And you.